My name is Carla España, and I'm the faculty associate of the Wolf Institute this year at Brooklyn College. I'm also faculty in the Department of Puerto Rican and Latinx Studies, and I was a former middle school teacher. So I must say that in preparation for this event, there was a tension between I love my job and I love what I do and I love my students here, and I wish I had this book when I was a sixth grade teacher. So I just had to say that. I served on the National Council of Teachers of English. We have a middle level section steering committee, which I encourage you all to connect with national organizations that are having these kinds of conversations. So I look forward to attending that conference every year in November with other English teachers to talk about this important topic as well. So as you heard, I'm a middle grade teacher at heart. I'm super involved in the children's literature world, and I love that my paths have crossed with Adam in other spaces. And so I want to thank you for joining us in person, and those of you who are on the live stream, please feel free to chat with us there. Before we proceed, just a quick few points. First, I want to invite you to save the dates, April 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. So please save those, the first week of April. We have several events where we're hosting our Hess Scholar, who is Paul Ortiz. He is the author of several books, one that we've been reading as faculty and many students have been reading here, in African American and Latinx history of the United States. And so as you can see, we have a lot of topics to get to. There are 4 days, but we have 25 speakers and 8 events. So yeah, if you see Director Gaston Alonso of the Wolf Institute during that week, you know, cheers on. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be great. We are so excited. So we have important discussions on academic freedom, the crisis of democracy, the role of solidarity and oral history in defending our freedoms and democratic practices. At the door, you receive the schedule of all of these events. So if you didn't, please get a copy on your way out. Second, if you're not already doing so, please follow us on social media. There are so many events that the way I keep track is I just go to my Instagram. So I go to the Wolf page on account on Instagram, and I'm just like, what's going on today? Because there's a lot. But we also have a YouTube channel, as those of you who are online are aware of, and the links are in the program. Third, if you're a student and didn't get to sign in, please do so. You know, attendance is important, and we want to make sure we let your instructors know that you are here. And of course, for those of you online, please feel free to ask questions. We'll be monitoring the chat during the session. And with that, let me thank the sponsors. We have departments who supported us, the Childhood Bilingual and Special Education, English, History, Judaic Studies, and Political Science. And now to begin, we are here to discuss not only this powerful book and this topic, but also to welcome author Adam Gidwitz to our campus again, because you are familiar, so you'll talk a little about that connection. And you have the bios in the program, but Adam Gidwitz, as you know, is the creator narrator of this amazing podcast for kids and families, Grim, Grimmer, Grimace. Adam also wrote the Newbery Honor winner, The Inquisitor's Tale, which is available here. This is our library copy, so I just have it here to show it to you, but I will return it so then you can borrow it. Please support your local libraries and our book and college library. It's really important for authors to circulate the books and show support. I visited my own different public libraries, and I got copies of Adam's books. As you can see, there are several. So this is just from the branch on the Stavros Narchos branch on 40th and 5th. It's my child's favorite library branch. But I came to know Adam's work through this series. I loved it so much, the Unicorn Rescue Society series, that I wrote a handbook for teachers who are celebrating bilingual and multilingual children with books that feature dynamic language practices. And I used this one and planned lessons with it. So Sasquatch and the Muckleshoot. So very familiar with this book because I then planned lessons and did a whole language analysis of it. So it's that good. Like, it's so fun. It's so fun. So as you can see on this slide, Adam has written a lot. And we'll get to focus today on Max in the House of Spies. But also joining us today is Professor Steven Remy, who you know is a scholar of modern German history and a professor of history right here at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. So let's begin our discussion. These are some of Professor Remy's publications, and I know in our conversation we'll get to discuss the connection between these works and his courses and Adam's book. And so here we go. I'm just going to grab my water and join you over there. Okay, and I think I'll leave this one on here. Actually, I'm going to transfer to yours so we get those slides. Okay. There it is. Okay. Now you can all hear me well? Okay. Or do you prefer?
For the
Do we need that for live stream?
folks?
Are we good with this? I can't.
It's capturing the room.
It's capturing the room, so we're good. So I thought we can start. A little bit about the discussion on the book origins. See if you can share with us on where did this idea for the book come from and why write this book?
Yes, thank you so much. And I just want to say a huge thank you to the Wolf Institute and to you and to Professor Remy and everybody who's here tonight. I'm very honored to be here talking about my book. So the origin of the book came from a couple different places, and I have the clicker because I could show you a couple of images. So the original idea for writing a book at all like Max and the House of Spies came from this man, Michael Steinberg. Michael Steinberg was a close family friend of mine when I was growing up, and when he was 10 years old, his mother put him on a train in Berlin, in Nazi Germany, and the train took him to a ferry, and the ferry took him to England, a country he had never been to, where he did not speak the language, did not know anyone there, his family didn't know anyone there, and he was placed with a family, and he didn't know whether he would ever see his mother again. Michael was one of the lucky ones. His mother did survive the Holocaust, and she was able to join him in England, and then they moved to the United States. So I always knew that I wanted to, the fact that, 10,000 children were taken away from their families and sent to this foreign country is just an amazing story, right? In addition to being an incredible fact of history, which we can talk more about as like a historical event. But it was just an amazing story. So I was like, well, I write stories for kids. This would be a good thing to write about. But I didn't know how to make it fun or exciting. So one of the things that we were just talking about is like, it's important to me as a writer of books for children that if I'm going to write about big, tough issues, and I do like to write about big, tough issues, that I make them fun, right? Like a kid, like I could say like the most brilliant, thematic, interesting things in the world. And if the book isn't interesting, no kid will ever know because they're not going to turn the pages. So I have to make it exciting first. So then I was reading a lot of books by a nonfiction writer named Ben McIntyre, who writes nonfiction spy books. And I learned some crazy, amazing spy stories. And I learned about a family, the Montagues. So this guy here, they were a wealthy Jewish family in England who did take in a Jewish refugee. And this guy, Ewan Montague, was really high up in British intelligence. He ran Operation Mincemeat, which is a really famous, like somewhat famous, becoming more famous spy thing. So I was like, okay, so I got those guys, I had the Kindertransport, so Kindertransport plus spies. And then the third thing that made me write it, and then I'll stop monologuing, I promise, is it was the early days of the pandemic. It was like April, May 2020. And all I could think about, some of you were like probably teenagers when that was happening, or young teenagers. But in that moment, it felt like everyone was lying, and I couldn't tell who knew that they were lying, right? There were some people, there were op-eds written in the New York Times saying, don't wear a mask, or don't wear an N95. And I was like, oh, okay, so we're not supposed to. And then somebody else was saying, do wear an N95. I was like, well, someone's not telling the truth, and I don't know if they know that. And then somebody was like, you should all inject yourselves with bleach. And I was like, that's probably not true. And then somebody did it, and they died. And so, it was like, and so the question that was rattling in my brain during those crazy months in quarantine was not why do people lie, but how does a country decide they're going to believe those lies? And so I started reading, I was like, as I was casting my mind around to think about how I could understand this, I took a book out of the library about, or I bought it actually, about Joseph Goebbels, the head of Nazi propaganda. Started reading about that. And so it was those three things, like the Kindertransport, spies, and that question of like, how does a country commit itself to lies? That made me want to get into it. And there's also what brought me to Professor Remy's class. So Professor Remy was kind enough to let me audit his class on Nazi Germany. And the thing that I found most interesting, I mean, I found lots of things interesting. One of the great things about Professor Remy, if you haven't taken one of his classes, you should, because he's not just teaching you the history, he's like making you think about what's complicated and surprising, unexpected about these pieces of history that you think you know. And so we talked a lot about like why people went along with the Nazis, why people were Nazis, and that was something that was really important to me as we were studying. I don't know if you want to talk at all about like how you approach that, or Carla.
Yeah, no, that'd be great if you can elaborate on what is it about that course that, or how is it that you structured that course to address that specific point of what's surprising, or how is it that a whole country can buy into this lie?
Well, I did that, and thank you all for coming. I should say thank you, Gaston, thank you. And it's a real pleasure and a privilege. When I taught that particular section of this course, which I've taught for many years, I've been teaching in Brooklyn College for 22 years, I think it was the first semester in which I had decided to assign a remarkable memoir called Account Rendered in its English version. And Account Rendered was written by a woman named Mita Mashman. Mita Mashman was born in 1918. That's very significant. So she was a teenager in 1933 when Hitler was appointed chancellor and the Nazis came to power. It's a bit of a complicated story, but this memoir was written in the form of a long letter to a Jewish friend of hers, and she did not know at the time that she wrote the memoir whether or not this person was still alive. I won't give it away. I'll try to avoid the spoilers.
That was how you got us to finish the book, actually, in class too.
Yeah,
I mean, like,
she used to
you got to
give away.
finish. You got to
Yeah,
finish
do
the
the
book to
reading.
find out if this person's alive.
Right.
Yeah.
And okay, so to get to the point, I wanted to assign it in part because it's a virtually unique document. We really don't have accounts of young women who became committed National Socialists, and this is the point about Mita Mashman. Mita Mashman was a Nazi. She wasn't just a Nazi in 1933, swept up in the initial patriotic enthusiasm of that moment. She remained a Nazi for the following 12 years and then beyond. And then, I won't go into the process, it did undergo a personal reckoning with her allegiance. And not only was she a Nazi, she became an official in the League of German Girls, the equivalent, girls and young women's equivalent to the Hitler Youth. Not only that, she became an agent of Nazi imperialism in Western Poland. The project there was to remove the resident Polish population, and ultimately, of course, the Jewish population, and settle this part of Western Poland with ethnic Germans. And she was involved in that process. The point is that she was a committed Nazi, so I assigned this as a way for students to follow the life of a committed Nazi, but also to get to this point of understanding how it is that somebody could have been drawn to National Socialism. In this case, an intelligent young woman from a middle-class family, patriotic but liberal middle-class family, whose parents did not want her to have anything to do with the Nazi Party. She's certainly rebelling. I think this is part of what is going on here. But that should not obscure the fact that here was somebody who became deeply enduringly ideologically committed to this regime. And look, if I could just say one more thing quickly about the importance of this document, I recommend everyone read it, Account rendered by Mita Mashman. It goes against a lot of what I think a lot of people assume, not without some reason, about women in Nazi Germany. Melita, in some ways, went against type. She wasn't going to sit at home. She never got married. She never had children. She didn't do what the ideology of the regime, this very patriarchal, male-dominated regime, expected of women, which was to stay home and to produce as many children as possible, particularly male children. She had no interest in any of that, and I think that we can take her on her word, given what we know about what it is that she did. So this is not somebody who was brainwashed. This was not somebody who was really duped. This is somebody who chose. This is somebody who chose to believe what it is that she believed. Who did not think that they were lies. This was a highly idealistic person. And I don't want to sound like I'm defending her choices. I think her choices were abominable, morally, ethically, but they were her choices nonetheless. So I will always continue to assign this.
Yeah, I think it's one of those books that should be, like paired with Anne Frank or something. It's sort of two girls about the same age taking very, very different paths through that time period. And the one thing I want to add to that, and then Carla, I'll toss it back to you, is that, you said that she didn't believe that they were lies, and she didn't. But there's this moment when she is essentially robbing an old woman of her house. She's taking this house and saying, like, Nazi officers are about to use this house. And for the first time, she kind of like feels, oh, I'm stealing something from this person. But all of the work that she did in Poland, which was very similar, she was one of the women with like a German shepherd, and sometimes a whip, I think she describes, to get people on the trains. She never thought about it, right? So it's one thing, like, you can decide to believe in lies, or you can decide not to think at all, right? And there was a way in which she thought about a lot of things, and then in crucial moments, she just turned off her judgment faculties altogether. And that was, again, something that fascinated me on the Nazi side. And then in this book, this is the first of two. The second half, which will come out next year, is more in Nazi Germany. This half is in England, and there are people on the English side who are kind of doing the same thing, who are in crucial moments turning off their brains when it comes to thinking critically about what they're doing, what role they're playing. So all that is fascinating to me, and thanks to Professor Remy. Like, I didn't know about her at all. I wouldn't know about any of it.
Can you tell us a little bit about as a writer, your process in taking in the research and the information from this course and your other readings? I know you all have to check out the back matter in the book. There's an annotated bibliography that's, I have like the call numbers for some of the books, because I was checking them out here. I was like, oh, we have a lot of text here. So, so how was that process for you in taking in, here are these historical events, here are these people, which you give us a little kind of insight into at the end when you say kind of like the parallels between some of the historical figures and then the characters you created. What does that look like as a writer? So you have historical events, you have character development, you have this plot. Walk us through. Was it linear? Was it like, what's your process? Yeah,
that's a great question. So I have a question for you all. Does anyone here ever do creative writing of any kind? Fiction writing? Yes. A bunch of you. Excellent. Have any of you ever tried historical fiction? Okay. Yeah. A couple of you. Great. Yeah. So my process, and everyone has a different process. So there's no right way to do this. But the only way that I've figured out that works for me is I'll be reading a book like Account Rendered, and I'm taking lots of notes in the margins, not on the facts, but on the things that are like, whoa, I cannot believe that. That's amazing. And I'm making a star, or I'm making notes in the margins, and I'm underlining. And I do that so that I can remember what I thought, but also so I don't have to stop and take notes in somewhere else, which slows me down. I'm a slow reader anyway. So I'm reading all this stuff, And then I go back and I open up a document and I just type all the notes that I've taken into a document. Just make a huge messy list. The other thing I'm doing at the same time when I'm not reading is I'm thinking about my characters and my plot. And I'm doing that as I'm just like walking around, walking the dog, taking my daughter to the bus, having a conversation with my wife, Professor Lauren Mancy right here, and she's like, "Where are you right now?" I'm like, "What? Sorry." And then whenever I have an idea or a thought that seems at all good about my characters or my plot, I email myself about it. And all of the emails have the same subject line. So the subject line for this one was called Kinderspion, which is German for Kinderspion, which is German for child spy. In fact, the book is called Operation Kinderspion. It's like the whole, it's like the series. So after I've read a lot of these books, I like make this list of all my notes, and I go through all those emails, and I also just put all of those into that same huge long list of stuff. They're all just ideas for the book. And then I read that document, and I'm like, okay, this goes with this. This obviously goes with this. This goes with this. And so I start to clump them into sort of topics. And then I take those topics, and I start to think about, okay, what order does it happen in my book? Like, clearly this part's got to go at the end. This part's obviously the very beginning. This is somewhere in the middle. And I start to refine that over the course of this taking months now. That's writing is not necessarily typing out the story, but just organizing and thinking about all that stuff until I've got an outline. And the outline was huge, and I had to cut it down. And then the book, the reason there's 2 volumes is because I originally wrote it, it was a 600-page book. And my editor was like, we cannot publish that for, kids.
For middle grade.
For middle grade. And so we had to break it up. But so there's a lot in there, and then you got to cut it, you got to cut it, you got to prune. And then I start actually writing the book, even though I've been writing it in this other form for a long time. That's the process.
Wow, that's new for me, because I haven't heard that type of process. That's so helpful to hear. And can you give us an example from the book, maybe a character or historical event that you had to go back and like dig deeper into the research? So whether it was like, there was a scene that really hit me as a former middle grade teacher where Max is reflecting back on his teacher and how his teacher changed. And then he said, my school wasn't always a Nazi school, but the curriculum changed. The way that the teacher would talk about him would be different. So what were those like characters informed directly by historical figures, or you can pick an event from the book?
Yeah, so most of the characters in the book, as you'll see if you get to read it, is most of them, other than the main character Max, are actual historical people that I stole from this research and I inserted into the book. I'm not very good at inventing characters, honestly. I find it very difficult to imagine a whole human. But if I've read a historical source and they've described that person, then I can just take that person and imagine with them, like they're my little puppet. And so, like, the Professor Goldenschaft is the teacher that you're thinking of. I did invent him, but definitely I had read in sources about the Nazification of the curriculum. And we've probably talked about it at some point in the class as well. And so I sort of imagined what that would have looked like. But one of the differences between, like, one of the things much harder about your job is that when you not only have to synthesize all this information, you have to be able to really remember exactly where it came from and cite your sources and everything. I put my sources in the back, but ultimately being a writer is a synthetic thing, not an analytic thing. So that I get to just mix it and mash it all up and like try to create, this is going to sound nerdy, but you don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to admit it. If anyone here plays like D&D or other kind of role-playing games, oh yeah, you're admitting it, I love it, yeah, there we go. Some of you are hitting each other, that's right.
No shame in that.
There we go. You guys together at your table or whatever are creating a world together that you live in. And that's the same thing as writing a novel. I've got to create this world. And so after a while, I have to forget that Melita was from Account Rendered and Professor Goldenschaft I made up, because they all live in this world together. But then I also need to keep all my books on my shelf, so at the end when I go through it back and make the bibliography, I can actually figure out where most of it came from. But some of that I forget. Some of that I don't remember where I got it. They just live in my world.
And then I wanted to ask also about your collaboration, and maybe in reading and the support. What did that look like in terms of Professor Remy? You bringing this vast historical knowledge, and then you're bringing in your vast expertise as a writer, and how did that communication collaboration work?
you want me to start? Do you want to?
Yeah, please.
I mean, mostly, before the class, I was like, "This is what I'm doing," and you were like, "I hope my class will be helpful." But I think you actually thought a little bit about what would be in the class that would be helpful, and then I asked you a lot of questions after class, during class. We had a lot of conversations, and then you read the book afterwards, gave me some notes, and in fact, I think just as a surprise to both of us, I had in the second volume, like the scary bad guy is somebody that you focused on in your research, right? Schiele from Heidelberg, right?
Yeah, he's somebody maybe I should say something about.
I think he's up there, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, that's comports with my memory of our interactions. The section of my course he taught was taught entirely online, so during the height of the pandemic period. And I'm so happy that you were there because you were such a thoughtful participant, and I think it was a very good class in terms of the makeup of the students.
It was also nice of you because it's like the 40-year-old has another question.
No, but yeah, and then there were, I remember lots of emails, and I had the privilege of reading the manuscript and being able to comment on that and make annoying, nerdy observations about, well, those two places in Berlin, he couldn't have walked that there that fast.
You need that.
And, all right. But we're still talking, so but I think from my perspective as a scholar of the period who focuses on perpetrators, I thought you did an incredible job of portraying the dynamics of a party and of the Nazi Party in a way that really reflects the way that scholars think about it now. And I could say something about that.
Sure.
And let me put it to you this way. And here we have a perfect rogues gallery that illustrates or personifies what it is I'm going to lay out to you. You take somebody like Albert Speer. Albert Speer was an architect, and Speer was born in 1905 or 1907. I may be getting them mixed up with
I
a
won't
lot
know.
of shale.
So no one's just
They were born within 2 years of each other, but that date's very significant. All right, they belong to a generational cohort that was too young to have fought in World War I. And there's been a lot of research, mainly from Germany, about the significance of this generational cohort. One German historian calls it the Generation des Unbedingten, which doesn't translate very well into English, but it basically means the unbounded generation. These are predominantly men when we're talking about the party and the SS. Too young to have fought in World War I, many of them thought that they had missed out on a life-defining, heroic experience. And many of them became ardent Nazis. And middle to high-ranking SS officers. And for those who survived the war, this is very significant, they were still relatively young when the war came to an end. And the question of their influence and role in post-war German society is a really important and fascinating question. Scheel was, for example, was a physician, a leader of Nazi university students at Heidelberg University. He became an official in the Nazi regime's Nazi student organization. He became a regional leader of Salzburg, in Austria, and he was an SS officer, in part responsible for the deportation of Alsatian Jews from Alsace in 1940. So he was very much a perpetrator, and still a relatively young man when the war came to an end. And for reasons that I don't really understand and find incredibly baffling, he was not convicted as a war criminal.
At Nuremberg.
Right, in those years of war crimes trials. And became very active in far-right politics in Germany, in West Germany in the early 1950s. And was arrested in early 1953 by the British in a big sweep of a nest of unrepentant Nazis who were plotting to destabilize the West German government by infiltrating one of the mainstream political parties. Okay, so Albert Speer, very quickly, an architect. He's often referred to as Hitler's favorite architect. I don't think that's accurate. I think Hitler's favorite architect was Hitler. But he became very close to Hitler, probably the closest thing Adolf Hitler had to, as an adult, to a friend, a male friend. And indulged Hitler, remained loyal to him to the very end, and became, late in the war, Germany's armaments minister. Played a very important role in keeping Germany's war machine running as long as it did. Was convicted in the main Nuremberg trial after the war, and served his full term, 20 years, I think. And then during all that time, lied. He spent the rest of his life lying about his past. My point, to get to the point about these two in particular, is that these were highly technically trained or highly educated men. They combined a high level of native intelligence, a high level of formal education and technical training with bureaucratic capabilities and fanatical ideological commitment. And it used to be the case that we assumed that you couldn't have both in one Nazi person. You were either a dunderheaded, unthinking Nazi fanatic, ideological fanatic, and a brute and a psychopath, or you were a bureaucrat, or maybe you were a scientist, literally a rocket scientist, or a physician, or Joseph Goebbels' case, a propagandist, a writer. But you couldn't be both things. But we understand now that you could. That it was possible to be all of those things. Highly trained, highly intelligent, highly educated, highly efficient in your work, and an ideological fanatic. So I think that the way that you brought these characters to life really reflected that terrifying reality about Nazi Germany.
Thank you. Yeah. It was something that was really important to me. I in that early stage of research, I came across a study from the 1970s in France where they were studying collaborators, people who had collaborated with the Nazis. And the question that they asked was, why did people collaborate with the Nazis? And the researcher, sort of a psychological anthropologist, concluded that there were as many reasons to collaborate with the Nazis as there were collaborators. Like, they all got something out of it, right? Like, Albert Speer got to be an architect. He was like a failing architect when Goebbels was like, why don't you redesign the Berlin headquarters of the Nazis? And he got to do it, and they liked it. So, like, he became a fanatic, and maybe he would have been, but it's also quite possible that he wouldn't have been. But this was his chance to become an architect. This guy was just a shitty person, excuse me. And they were all really, really shitty people. But he was like, and when I was writing about Shale and what I was trying to like imagine about Shale, like you heard Professor Remy say that detail about that generation who felt like they didn't get to be heroes and their older brothers did get to be heroes. And I found that just like such a detail that just stuck in my brain. And if you're writing, if you're doing writing yourself, if there's a detail like that, if there's something that you come across in reality or in a story or in your own story that like you just can't get out of your head, and you're like, what is with that? That's the core. That's something huge. Keep it. and put it in your writing somehow. And so that, it felt to me so poignant and terrible at the same time, right? That this guy could have been 14 and seeing the 18 and 20-year-olds coming home from World War I, like missing legs and missing eyes and being like, I could have been like them, right? Like, ugh. And that would have led him to being one of like just the worst Nazis. That's an amazing dynamic to me and something that I wanted to explore, and came out of just a few sentences that Professor Remy said during a lecture, that it was like, I gotta explore that.
I wanted to turn to something that I hear often on school visits or when I speak to different districts across the country, or that you'll read, especially lately when you think about these issues of book bans and censorship, that everyone immediately goes to like Florida and Texas, but it's happening right in our own backyard. There were books thrown out at PS 55 in Staten Island in November. We just read about it last week in the news. And so I hear often the narrative of like, well, children are too young to read about this, you know, this is too difficult of a conversation, or, you know, we don't know how to talk about it. But what I find that's really powerful in all your books, because this is the latest, but in the other ones that I found too, in the Unicorn Rescue Society series that I was talking about earlier, is that you're taking, so you have these historical events. Oh, the other one, yeah, I'm going to put it up too.
Okay.
I'll bring it up.
Okay,
You have these historical events, and you have these really complex characters, but you somehow, as a writer, you're balancing like a day in the life of a middle school kid with a day in the life of a middle school kid living through this time period. So can you talk a little bit about addressing how you do that as a writer in an age-appropriate way for your readers, where you take, like, I wrote down notes, you had lines about colonialism, you talked about trauma, like the word trauma is in there in the first chapter about like what happens to a kid who has to leave his family and is sent away, right? So, and you have the word trauma there. There's a character who talks about what the British did in Trinidad. And then you like quote, and then you, in the annotated bibliography, you sent us a C.L.R. James, you know, article on that. So tell us a little bit as a writer, how do you address that so well that we can use this book with our grade students?
Thank you. I mean, I think my philosophy about it is that kids experience all sorts of really complicated and messed up stuff all the time, right? They're in households where everything is going on. I mean, it's just like Ellie hears half the things that we talk about. It's like, woof. And the thing is, you know, they understand what they can understand. They understand what they're ready to understand. I have the strong belief that, like, kids know what they need on an instinctual level. And so what they need to understand, they take in. Like, you know, you've seen that kid, be it a 2-year-old or a 12-year-old, who reads the same book over and over and over again, right? And that's because they know that there's something in that book that they need to understand. And they don't know it, they couldn't explain that to you. They just need to read it. And then one day, they don't want to hear it anymore. They're like, done, right? And that's because they got it. And their mind is ready to learn something new. Likewise, when they're reading one of my books, you know, there's a lot of tough stuff in my books. I mean, even my first books, the Grimm fairy tale books, you know, they are the real scary Grimm fairy tales. So, like, kids are getting decapitated in the first chapter. They get their heads put back on, so they're fine. But you know, and kids, like, who don't want to read that, they'll either close the book, or they'll let it go over their heads, right? So there's a lot in Max and the House of Spies that kids aren't going to get. But they don't care, because it's a good story, and they're excited about the story. And then there's stuff the kids are ready for, and they'll go and they'll wrestle with that, and they'll leave other stuff behind, right? So for me, I choose what goes in the book based on what I'm wrestling with. My editor once told me that my best books are not ones where I know what I want to say, but where I ask questions I don't know the answer to. And so, you know, in Max and House of Spies in particular, I'm asking this question: how do people commit themselves to lies on a nationwide basis? And so I'm wrestling with those questions. And I want to tell the kids a great story. And if I can find a way to weave questions I want answers to, or I want to wrestle with a great story, kids are just as smart as we are. I mean, many of you are young people yourselves, but like, I was talking to some 5th graders today at the Brooklyn Public Library. There was a school from Brownsville, a school from Bed-Stuy, a school from Sunset Park. And I asked them a question that is sort of implied in this book, I asked them, if you had to choose between justice on the one hand and your mother on the other hand, which would you choose and why? And I was kind of quoting Albert Camus, something that he said during the Algerian-French War. And you should have heard those answers. Kids are brilliant. Kids were like, well, I would work for justice, because if I worked for justice, that would save my mother and her whole family too. You know, things like that. And these are 10-year-olds. So they're smart enough to do it if we give them a story that they can hook their teeth into. And if they don't get it or they're not ready for it, then they let it go over their heads and they just stay with the story. So that's how I think about it.
And then, can you tell us a little bit more about those visits? And what I know you started, I think, February with your visits? Or
January, yeah.
Earlier?
Yeah.
So what else has come from those visits that children that has surprised you or maybe shocked you, or things that children have said?
Kids say the darndest things, as they say. They're amazing. The kids have been incredible. Yeah, I mean, I think that conversation has happened in a lot of different schools, and those schools have been, those kids have been amazing. So whether they're talking about justice, whether they're talking about their mothers, whether they're challenging me in the basis of that conversation, they surprise me every time. So it's been very deep, and you know, as we're all aware, this has been like a tough time in talking about Jews and Jewish history also in the world, right? And what's going on in Israel and in Gaza, which is so painful, has also been like reflected on talking about anti-Semitism and stuff. And so those things have also come up in schools, and engaging with those kids. You know, there was a school that didn't want to have me come and speak because the topic was Jewish history, and they were worried that that would be triggering to the community, and so they canceled the visit. That felt to me like the wrong move, but that's their choice. I was at a school in D.C. where I met with the Jewish affinity group afterwards, because they always have whatever speaker comes meets with whatever affinity group they would be a part of. And there were middle schoolers, and this girl raised her hand, 7th grade girl, and she said, my mother worked in Gaza for 3 years. And I was like, incredible, amazing. And I expected her to use that as like bona fides, to be like, and this is what I think should happen. And I was like, go ahead. And she said, can you explain what's happening there? And I was like, what? And then I tried to do my best job to give like a really fair and empathic explanation of what's happening there. And then a kid raised his hand in the back and he goes, can you explain what's happening on college campuses? And I'm like, who's talking to these kids, right? Like, everyone's so angry that they're shouting and they're not talking to the children. And so to see that, so then I had a very powerful experience 2 weeks ago where I was going to go to school outside of Chicago that was a majority Palestinian school. And they were worried about me talking about Max, given what's going on, you know, for the Palestinian community experiencing, you know, genocide. And they're like, I don't want to hear about this, I'm worried about that. So there was a lot of debate in the school about whether I should come. And they did what I thought was the right thing. And they were like, you should come. And kids who were worried about it wore some protest stuff, like, you know, sashes like Free Palestine stuff. I agree with them. They didn't know that. They just assumed that I didn't. But they listened. And I told a fairy tale, and we talked, and we laughed. We had an incredible time. And like, we could see that we could talk to each other, and we could understand each other, despite the tensions, right? That community did what I think is the right thing, which is listen and talk. So it has been an amazing 10 weeks that I've been talking about this book, and I think mostly like really beautiful and incredible. So at least for me.
Thank you for sharing that. That's why I was asking that, because as I was reading this, I was also thinking about the parallels of like what I see on my social media. Like I know you have several of your works are being turned into series or films. Which one of those?
So Tell Dark and
Which
Grim
one?
is a
Netflix.
series on Netflix. Yeah.
So we don't have this yet, but I want to say, unfortunately, like I'm reading this and I'm seeing the parallels too of like the images that are coming to my mind, and a common thread that I saw throughout the whole book that you did so well with the dialogue with different characters was like imperialism, colonialism, and the impact on children. And I thought how this is what made me wish. I was like, oh, I want to go back to teach middle school, because I want to have these conversations. I want to be a teacher having these conversations with the kids. Because I find that this is such a helpful entry point
Thank you.
as a thread, right? Because there was like a criticism of like how the British treated different populations. So while he's in England and he's learning about this, right? Max is learning about this. And so I found how helpful that is. And I do that in my department, right? In Puerto Rican Latinx Studies, we're talking about imperialism, colonialism, and what it might be for somebody living in Puerto Rico now. And then I'm like, this is such a helpful text to see the thread of the impact of that on children. And so thank you for sharing those experiences from your visit, because the kids are living it now.
Yeah.
And so I encourage all of you, if you get stuck and you're talking to children in your families, or those of you who are in education or thinking about going into education, is the power of children's literature to be your thought partners, right? And like, I always see books as my thought partners or my teaching assistants. I'm like, all right, I'm going to go with this book to talk about this.
Yeah. Another powerful thing that you can do when you're talking to young people is just to admit when you don't know. When you think you have a strong feeling about something and you're like, but I'm not 100% sure. Or like, I think it's this, but other people say this, and I don't actually know the answer. Because they appreciate it so much, because they never know, right? And they're like, how do you know everything? And the answer is we don't, right? And so they really appreciate that humility, because then it gives them an entry point to be like, well, then what about this? And you're like, oh yeah, good point. They appreciate being treated like thought partners, because they can be.
I know we have about 5 more minutes before I turn it over to you all for questions, so have your questions ready, and then if, I'm going to check also if any on the live stream have questions, but I wanted to see if we could end with an excerpt.
Oh yeah.
So I'll give you a moment.
Sure.
And I also have, I'll put up chapter 1 just so you can see like how it starts up here. 'Cause I have
I'll
some-
probly read that. Actually.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
see.
because
We're
don't
prepared.
put it up, because then they'll be reading over my.
Oh, yes.
You know
Okay,
what I
great,
mean?
great.
I'm
I'll just put the
self-conscious that
cover.
I miss
Where's the
pieces,
cover?
You guys are like, that's not what it says, and I'm like, I know, I'm sorry. Sure, I'll read the first like 3 pages. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chapter 1, Max and the House of Spies. Oh, and this is going to introduce an entire element of the book that we never even talked about, so you're going to probably be slightly surprised. Once there was a boy who had 2 immortal creatures living on his shoulders. This was the 4th most interesting thing about him. The first most interesting thing about Max, that was his name, was that he was a genius. He could make a working radio from the junk at the bottom of a trash can, and he could usually predict what someone's going to say 10 minutes before they say it. The second most interesting thing about Max was that when he was 11 years old, his parents sent him away from Germany, where he was born and grew up, to England, all by himself, even though he'd never been there, didn't know anybody there, and barely spoke any English. The third most interesting thing about Max was that when he got to England, he fell in with spies. Real, honest-to-goodness spies. A lot. And the fourth most interesting thing about him was that he had 2 immortal creatures living on his shoulders. But that's probably what you have the most questions about, so let's start there. The 2 immortal creatures appeared the day his parents sent him to England. His family had been arguing about it for weeks. Their small Berlin apartment shook as Max stomped from the living room to his bedroom to the kitchen and back again, shouting things like, "You can't make me go," and "Everything is fine, who cares about the stupid Nazis?" and "What if you need me?" and, more quietly, alone in his room, "What if I need you?" But no matter what Max said, his parents had refused to change their minds. His mother had held him at the train station, his father had stroked his hair. They waved as the train pulled out, taking Max and the 198 other Jewish children to Holland and the ferry. Max hadn't waved back. He just stared at them and thought, how could you do this? The children had left the train station in Holland and boarded a steam-powered ferry. With a blast of its foghorn, the ship had pushed out into the North Sea, bound for England. 31 minutes later, Max had fallen asleep. This might be a little surprising, but after a trauma, something really awful that happens to you, your brain often makes you fall asleep right away. Maybe to help you process the trauma, or maybe because your brain is scared of more traumas and figures you won't have to experience them if you're sleeping. Whatever the reason is, it happens a lot, and it happened to Max. So he fell asleep 31 minutes into the ferry ride. 32 minutes into the ferry ride, he heard a voice in his ear. "Max! Max!" Max jerked awake and looked around. "Max, you are drooling." Max quickly wiped his mouth. Wait, who said that? He looked to either side of him. He was sitting on a bench in the belly of the steamship. There were other kids on other benches. Some boys were sleeping, leaning against each other, not too far away. A girl had her face buried in her handkerchief, crying. But the voice had been right next to his ear, and it had not sounded like a kid's voice. "What'd you wake him up for?" said another voice, very near his other ear. "He was drooling. It was disgusting." I thought he would want to know. Max spun from side to side. Where were these voices coming from? You think he doesn't have bigger problems than drooling in his sleep? The poor kid just lost his country, his home, his parents. You can't let him drool a little bit? Now Max was staring at his left shoulder. His eyes came to focus. Crouching there was a tiny man with a bulbous nose, thinning hair, twinkling eyes, and a sour smile. "Hiya," he said. Max screamed and fell off the bench. All right, so that's the beginning of Max now. Yeah, we didn't talk about those creatures at all, but you'll have to read the book to find out.
That could be part of a question. All right, so we'll take some questions. We'll transition. Yes, go ahead.
So you talked a lot about how like it's so important for you to be writing these books and exposing children to these historic events.
I think Carla said that. I didn't say it was important for me to write these books.
Well, I think so.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank you. That's very nice.
We agree.
I'll let you say.
And well, how did you go about like? Did you have to censor something? How do you go about writing these things for kids? Like, what do you do to make sure that it's true, that it's real, but it's not too much?
Yeah.
There's some. Well, you guys talked about kids can handle this, but what does it get to the point where they can't handle it?
That's a great question. A lot of that has to do with just like feel, right? Like if you know kids, I was a teacher for 8 years. I still feel like I'm a 10-year-old boy inside. I write for the kid that I think I am. And so there are some things that are icky. For example, kissing, disgusting. Never in my books. I don't know why. I just don't like it. And so I mean, I like it in real life, but in books I don't like it. And so it doesn't go in my books. And so there's a sense when I'm writing where I'm like, okay, this part feels gratuitous. This feels like, ugh, I feel terrible. And then there are other things where I'm like, this is scary. This makes me tense. But as long as he's going to be triumphant through it somehow, I think it's okay. And part of the process also is you write, and then you go away for a month or two from your writing, and you read it later. And then you read it, and you have to be really honest with yourself about the quality of it, about everything about it. And when you read it later, you try to read it as a whole different person, and you're like, ugh, this chapter. And then you have other people read it. So my wife reads it, Professor Remy reads it, my editor reads it, and they all tell me, like, this part, not so sure. So you have a lot of checks on you. But mostly, for that, honestly, I think it's just your gut. You write for people that you know. You know kids, you're kids. You know teenagers, you're teenagers. You know adults, you're adults.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
My question follows on that a little bit. I'm wondering if you ever think about the adults who might be reading the book, especially for something like this that has such adult subject matter. And there are so many books for young readers these days that have crossed over into being popular among adults. And for any of your books or this in particular, do you think about the adult audience also when you're writing it?
I do, and I try not to. When I start thinking about the adults, if I notice myself doing it, then I'm like, stop it. Especially, after the Inquisitor's Tale won the Newbery honor, suddenly, like, that Newbery committee starts living in your head, and they're like, were they like this? And that is just irrelevant. So when my very, very first book that was never published I wrote about an historical novel about ancient Egypt. And I wrote it, and I read a chapter a day to read to my students. I was teaching second grade, and I wrote like a chapter, and I read it to them, and they were like, what happens next? And I was like, I don't know. And so every night I went home and wrote a chapter and read it to them the next day, which if any of you are becoming teachers or teachers in training, it's a great way to make yourself write a book. Because if you start reading a story to a group of second graders, and you don't finish it, if they like it, they will kill you. They're terrifying little creatures. So every night I was writing another chapter of that book. And when the school year was over, it was 100 pages long. And I quit my job as a teacher, or I was not happy. And I started to revise the book in order to try to get it published. And I did the stupidest thing I've ever done in my career. I went and I tried to make it sound like it was Johnny Tremaine or some like old-fashioned Newbery winning book. I thought about what the adults would think about this book. And so I wrote it so it sounded like a good novel. And it was 400 pages long when I was finished. And I sent it to an agent, and she was nice enough to meet with me, and she was like, it's not very good. And what I know now, and I didn't know then, was that first version, I wrote it for the kids. I looked at their faces, and I thought about how they would react, and I wrote to them. And then I rewrote it for grown-ups, and that was the mistake I made. So I try never to do that again, but it creeps in sometimes.
Can I ask you something about that? I attended a reading you gave recently of a book, and we were at this great children and young adult bookstore in Manhattan, the name of which
Books of Wonder.
Books of Wonder. Thank you. Right off Union Square. That's beautiful, beautiful shop. And you mentioned the influence of this great book, The Phantom Toll Booth, on you. And I was thinking in terms of your question, that popped into my mind immediately. So in terms of influences on you, there's that book, and I don't know if anybody here has read it. Ella?
Yeah, all right, we got a few.
The Phantom Toll Booth. Who are your models in this realm, right? In this crossover realm, or influences, or people writers that you looked to?
I mean, the writer that I look to the most, though, is probably not an influence in this, though Phantom Toll Booth is actually a great example of that, of this thing where it's like, he does very, heady stuff where, like, adults can totally get lost in it and a kid might miss it. But honestly, the writer that influences me the most is Roald Dahl. If you ever read Matilda, or James the Giant Peach, or BFG, he writes, like, dramatic, often quite scary. I mean, The Witches is terrifying. I was reading My Witches with the second grade class that I was teaching, and I got 2 phone calls from 2 separate parents on the same night, being like, the kids are having nightmares, can we stop? And so he takes them into powerful and deep emotions. Parents are always dying. But he doesn't do the sort of, what's that? And he fought Nazis too. And he was a little bit anti-Semitic himself, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. But the book is good. He was a spy. The books are great. And but in terms of like this kind of thing, it's like a combination of that kind of book and then like the books that you assign, and see if I can combine those two.
Is there a question in the back? No, or that was a hand for whoever. That's, oh, yes, question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What made you decide to include the Dybbuk and the Cobalt?
Yeah, so those 2 guys, Steinenberg, are a kobold and a Dybbuk. So Berg is the one who was like, you're drooling, it's disgusting. He's a kobold. Kobold is a German for goblin. It's literally the same word. And cool fact that you can stump your friends with, also not what they teach in D&D. So kobold and D&D are different. Kobold were thought to be like they would inhabit your house or like a mine where you worked, and they would make mischief. And if you're familiar with the color blue, the color cobalt's blue is called that because it is the color of blue stone cobalt. And cobalt is called that because when they were mining cobalt in Germany, cobalt releases a poisonous gas when it's mined, and miners were getting sick and dying, and they blamed cobalt. So the color is actually, it means goblin. And Dybbuk is from Jewish mythology. They attach themselves to you, and they make your life miserable. And there are all sorts of forms of Dybbuks and what they do, and sometimes they're weirdly sexual. Obviously, I was not putting that in my book. Yeah, so essentially, I wanted 2 creatures on his shoulders, and if any of you ever watched The Muppet Show, I was essentially thinking of Statler and Waldorf from The Muppet Show, just sort of kibitzing and making his life miserable. Because I knew he was going to be alone in really terrible situations, particularly in the 2nd volume when he's in Nazi Germany, spoiler alert. And I wanted him to have somebody to talk to, and I also wanted somebody to make us all laugh, as like, Gustav Scheel is closing in on him. Yes?
Yeah.
I have a question. You read historical fiction. So do you make the history fit the story, or the story fits
Fit the history. Yeah.
Do you put, let's say you're stubborn and the history can't really match the story.
Mm-hmm.
Do you force it, or do you?
That's a great question. So what I try to do, and this is one of the reasons I would have to email Professor Remy all the time. I'd be like, okay, I really want this to happen, but can you explain to me again one more time? So my rule in historical fiction is, and this is just mine, on these pages, nothing should exist. I probably made some mistakes, but nothing should exist that contradicts something that we know. So I would the Blitz. You know, you can see on the cover like there's some planes dropping bombs, right? I have the Blitz start at like 4 p.m. or so because I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that's when it actually started in London. That's when they started dropping the bombs. And originally I had written it so it started like around lunchtime, and that was not true. Well, I am not going to contradict something that we know is true, even if it helps my plot. But there are things that, like, Max wants to get sent back to Nazi Germany as a spy. Britain never would have sent a 12-year-old boy to Nazi Germany, especially not a 12-year-old Jewish boy. They're not going to do that. Ooh. So that I'm asking us to, like, you know, take a leap of faith or whatever. But there are lots of things that happen that we don't know what really happened. And so if we don't know, if it's the sort of thing that could have happened, then I'll put it in there. So I think like there's I think we probably talked about like a restaurant near 8 Albrechtstrasse, the security office. Yeah, and then there was a restaurant near there called like Holster, I can't remember, and it's in the second volume of the book. Like, do I know that Shale ate there for lunch? No. But could he have? Of course. And so that's something that I feel comfortable putting in the book. That's a good question.
Yes, we'll have 2 more, yeah.
There's a book I'm familiar with a bit called Goodnight Stories from Rebel Girl, and Sophie Scholl is in it in volume 2. And when my granddaughter started talking about Sophie Scholl, I said, who was talking to you about this? And thinking, how is this being presented? So you might want to just give a minute on who Sophie Scholl is.
Do you want to give a minute on Sophie?
Sure. Sophie Scholl was a university student in Munich. She was Christian German, and along with her brother, and he was a Wehrmacht veteran, and a number of other acquaintances, also Munich University students, a couple of their professors were involved, formed an anti-Nazi resistance group called the White Rose. It was deeply informed by their Christian faith, and they wrote leaflets and distributed them randomly, anti-Nazi leaflets, in which they denounced the regime, they denounced the mass murder of the Jews, they denounced the ongoing war and all the crimes associated with it. They engaged in some graffiti in Munich and other places, and they were caught. And it came to a very bad end, but they became a symbol of something that was very unusual in Nazi Germany, and that was organized resistance. Real resistance, not just believing something, having some doubts and not ever doing anything about it. They did. They made a choice, and it cost them their lives. The fact that they made that choice, and so few other people did, by the way, I should add, is one of the reasons why, for a long time after the war, most Germans considered them to be traitors, not heroes. It's only been in relatively recent years that they have been celebrated as, in a way I think that they deserved. And it made a kind of sense, right? If you believe, as most Germans did after the war, that we were forced, we had no choice. And then you have examples of people who did choose, and it cost them their lives. Well then, yeah, so.
So that's my question.
Sorry, Diane,
Thank you.
going on.
That's why I find it so interesting. So here's this child in my family who was 8 when she read that. And we're having a discussion about her, about Sophie. And I was just reading a novel about the deportation of Jews to Shanghai, that you could get into Shanghai without, even if you were stateless. And I was just, we now have a major National Party candidate who's talking about deportation. So what kinds of books should there be for 8 and 10 and 12-year-olds who may see something like this? I mean, how, if we could have seen this coming, what kind of books did those kids read?
That's a great question. It's wonderful. I think that there are books out there like that. I think a lot of the books that ended up in the dumpster outside of PS55 are those books, right? So I certainly hope that Max is a book that helps people think about what's happening now. In my Unicorn Rescue Society, I work with a great author named David Bowles. And in our book on the Chupacabras on the border is all about a border wall. But a lot of the things that David writes about, there are, you could probably speak to this, that there are lists out there of what do you think?
Yeah, so definitely I would add to David Bowles, Aida Salazar. There are a lot of authors, at least in the, I'm part of the Educator Advisory Council for the Latinx Kid Lit Book Festival. That was started during the pandemic because authors couldn't get to schools in person, and so they have 4 years worth of programming of author talks online. But a lot of authors are have been writing and about this topic of deportation. I know in one of my books I'm featuring Land of the Cranes, which is by Aida Salazar, and it's a middle grade novel in verse with a family that's been separated, and it's a mother and child who end up in a deportation center. And it's told through poetry. But yeah, I'm definitely reach out. I'm happy to share book lists on that because this is what we're doing now. It's like we're using children's books to help your 8, 10, and 12-year-olds think about what's happening now.
And there's a wonderful YA novel for a little bit older kids called Internment by Samira Ahmed that sort of imagines a near future where Muslims are interned in this country and what that looks like. So, yeah, so there are.
I just sent a copy of that to the Immigrant Student Success Office
today.
I just
That's
had
great.
a stack of books that I gave them, so that's on my list there.
Well,
Yeah.
do either of you know if there's a literature related to the internment of Japanese Americans?
Yeah, there have been
the
some books.
audience that we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head. There's a great graphic novel that came out about a boy learning baseball in one of these. And it had on my side table now. I can't remember what it's called. But yes, there is out there too. People are telling that story. Who's the guy from Star Wars?
George Sakai.
Yes, he wrote a book about it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
I know we have, I think, time for one last question. Oh, okay.
I noticed that you had books also at least inspired somewhat about the Grimm fairy tales and stuff like that. And I guess I'm just wondering what role, I guess, fear should play in the literature that we give to children. Because I think there is something useful in it, and that a lot of cultures have the stories that we've told our children for a long time have contained, yes, other messages that we want. There's also like this deep seed of just fear.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know where that goes.
Yeah.
Yeah. What does that mean?
That's a great question. And I have a sense that you, like me, just also get a kick out of scaring kids. I can just see that inside of you. Yeah, it's an impulse. I can't explain it. I really believe that, like, kids, not all kids, but many kids really like scary stories, in large part because it's a chance to test themselves, right? Kids are often very, like, protected. Not all kids, but many kids live in a very protected shell, and they see this scarier world out there that they know they are not allowed to have access to. And so they want to test themselves. What would it be like? How would it feel if my parents, were eaten by a stampeding rhinoceros, as James the Giant Peach starts? Or if I was sent away from my parents? Or if I found myself in a candy house with a cannibalistic baker woman or witch or whatever, right? They want to test themselves and see how they would feel. And every culture handles it differently. So the German fairy tales are real messed up, real scary. Those Grimm books have been most popular of anywhere in the United States in South Texas. The Latinx kids in South Texas love scary stories. They just love them. They love them so much they will bring their families and their cousins and their aunts and uncles out to a bookstore to hear more scary stories. So different cultures deal with the scary stories in different ways, but I think that kids, they want it, and not all kids. And it's the nice thing about books versus a show or a movie, right? A movie comes at you fast, and you can't control yourself. You can't control it. And you might see something you don't want to see. But a book, you only see what you choose to create in your head, and you only read what you make yourself read, and you could always close that book. And so, again, I think a nice, for me, theme to end on is kids know what they need. We've got to offer that to them and let them choose.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Carla.
And please, on your way out, you can come say hi. There are copies of the book here for sale. You can get them signed, and if you have questions that you didn't want to ask, in front of everybody,
Yeah, come say.
come join us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really great. Yes, we'll do it. That was awesome. Thank you.
As many as I can.
No, yeah.